Our own dear Catherine of Siena would always start the letters that she dictated with a greeting in the precious blood. It is with joy that we enter this month of the precious blood on this, which would have been for centuries the feast of its glory, the blood that redeemed us. And so I'm doubling up the collects because I want to include that in the local celebration, which is important, as you know, our great Oliver Plunkett, of whom we have the head just nearby. And you may notice next time you're venerating it that it is not just a skull. A skull, after a while, becomes a skull. This is still somebody who has the expression of a person at the moment of death. That has been frozen. It's as though God the Father had with him his smartphone for our benefit. This is time stuck. He is in agony. It is atrocious pain. Remember the details. He was suffering not as a witch that had burning as the gentle reward, but as a traitor. And therefore it was prolonged. First of all, hanged on the famous Tyburn tree, and then taken down while not dead, brought back to consciousness, and then opened up, the drawn bit. Our local martyr, St. Richard Gwyn in mid-Wales, in the process of that disembowelment, said in Welsh, seeing his entrails come out, O Dduw Gwyn, pa beth ydy hyn? O white God, that means O blessed God, what thing is this? And the kindly executioner calmly replied, it is the execution of the High King. Well, Oliver too had that gentle treatment. The third part was the moment of actual death, when the heart was taken out and, according to the ritual, was held up before all and sundry, still beating. Behold, the heart of a traitor, to which everyone was expected to reply, long live the king! In the case of St. John Roberts, whose house is very close to our own house in North Wales, a Benedictine martyr, caught in his robes at the altar at the last gospel, open up in the name of the king! And they bashed the door down, caught in the act. In the case of him, at that same place, Tyburn, when that was pronounced, silence. No one dared say anything against John Roberts. Why? Because a few weeks before, he'd been going round the streets of London next to the dying people during the plague. This was a man of God. There was kindness in his Welsh face. No one wanted his end. Well, this particular saint, Oliver Plunkett, as late as 1681, very late in time, was the last of a mighty army. Do you remember the first? You little people were sponges. Do you remember who the first were in the Protestant Reformation? Who the martyrs were? Well, they were the Carthusian martyrs just before Thomas More and John Fisher. Because Thomas More, from the Tower of London, peeped out and saw them being carried on the hurdle. That is something that used to go through the streets of London, and there were no wheels on it. It was behind a horse or horses, and they would go bump, 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 as a public humiliation until they got to the Tyburn tree. Well, Thomas More was soon to follow, and so was John Fisher. That was in 1535. And between them and this last one, on this day in 1681, was a huge army. Many Jesuits, there were Benedictines, many secular priests, there were Franciscans, and there were also lay people, men and women. Women had special treatment. They were crushed to death. Such was the fate of Margaret Clitheroe, crushed to death slowly. They could opt out. I can't bear it anymore. I can't face it. No. And many were they who, as it started in the case of Oliver Plunkett, ended up in a cold, damp prison and never got out. Less glory for other people there. And by the way, that prison door is still to be seen in Drogheda. It was an awful prison, Newgate, and he was there for a long, long time. We forget that. And there were others too who didn't actually make it to the gallows. One or two here or there were so badly tortured that their life didn't get further than prison. Indeed, we have the testimony of Edmund Campion, because there were various ways and means of extracting information about the underground network, who was involved. They wanted contacts. And the classic one, apart from the manacles, was the rack. And we have, from his own mouth, this fact that he thought that as things got worse, at the third bout session on the rack, he really thought they meant to end his life because he could feel his members just coming apart. And yet, these mangled members, not his but another, managed to celebrate the sacred mysteries in the Tower of London, not once but more than once. We know that Père Gérard, it was a Jesuit, was actually there, tortured badly, but found means of smuggling in, so using orange juice to make messages. You know what happens? Put orange juice against a candle and it comes up. Hidden script. He got the necessary things to celebrate the sacred mysteries in the very place where they were torturing him for doing so. This was what the Holy Sacrifice meant to these people. And when he was admitted to the Tower of London, he knew what was ahead. And he found in the first cell that he was put in a great joy. He noticed that the prisoner before him had carved out, as it were, a secret oratory in the cell. He got the message, he could see what was chiseled out there, and he knew who the martyr was before him. And he was consoled by being able to pray in the same holy corner of the cell. He eventually, despite his mangled limbs, managed to escape. And that's how we know all that happened in the underground. We still have in Latin his long diary written afterwards. We couldn't put it down in the monastery in France. It was better than any thriller, and it was the truth. And it described meticulously the inside of a man in torture. When he was put in the manacles, the pain was just so atrocious as all the weight of his body began to reside on two weak points of that body. The pain was so excruciating that a flash came through his mind. I can't go any further. And then, in his diary, he wrote this: it was only a flash, put there surely by the enemy. And he immediately saw where it was coming from and burst into mental prayer and sometimes vocal prayer, and he was given strength. Eventually, he fainted. They put him down, and then they started pouring boiling water down his mouth and throat to wake him up, which he did. And when he woke up again, he put himself back in the manacles to show his determination. So they saw him, and the manager in charge of that particular bureau said to him as he saw him, "Okay, die there," and shut the door and went out. Eventually they took him down, but several sessions happened, and his arms, these parts there, the wrists swelled, became enormous, and they knew the process, and they had to have special things to put on them afterwards, enormous sleeves. Those were the limbs that got him out on sheets through the bars of the Tower of London. He got back to the headquarters, but he wasn't sent back to the mission, even though he wanted to. That's how we know. All this underground of holy priests, each with an alibi, in the deep undergrowth of London mainly, but also in the north, Catholic north. I make a jump. This then was the end of a long line. Oliver Plunkett, the first Irishman, primate of all Ireland, who, by the way, had lived where I lived in Rome, and every time I vested in the sacristy of the Angelicum, the Convito, there was a picture of him there. That's where he'd been. Holy ground. He, with all the dignity of an archbishop and a primate, calmly could easily have defended himself, but there was no defense opportunity given. They knew that they couldn't get what they wanted in Dundalk, so they took him out of context and didn't let the witnesses arrive to testify. This then was our order of justice in 1681 in England. All this because of one man's problem, 1 century and a half earlier. Edward Henry VIII, who then, under Edward, opened the doors for error and Protestantism. All because Rome would not mess with the indissolubility of marriage. So what have we? A huge victory for all the powers of hell who will do anything to deprive souls of the means of salvation, anything to keep them from a state of grace. What puts us in a state of grace? The sacraments. Get a whole continent, if possible, without the sacraments. It's what he did. Because what came out of England was the whole Commonwealth. All those areas touched by England went without sacramental grace. And so it is to this day. I just finish with one little anecdote. One day, as guest master in the monastery, I was preparing for ordination a young American, because they used to come from Rome just for ordination. And he had been an Anglican. He'd seen the truth and had come over. His brother was still an Anglican, and indeed an Anglican clergyman, and married. He was high church, and he had a suspicion of things. He was uneasy. He was at the altar celebrating the Anglican communion service as a high Anglican, and he was in serious doubts, and he was sincerely praying for light. And just as he got close to the consecration, so-called, he heard a voice. And I asked my friend, who at that point was a deacon already, the American, his brother, now, did he actually hear something, or was it just his thought pattern? No, he insisted. He heard it objectively, because he told him. He heard clearly this word. Don't genuflect. So he obeyed. And the last I heard at that point was that he was in conversation with the authorities to see how to handle the case in view of coming over. We can be taken in by big mitres and fancy chasubles, by beautiful structures and even high liturgy. But either you have it or you don't. In Ireland, we had it without big mitres and fancy churches. But I am sure that in these little hovels dotted around the country, there was far more intensity of union between heaven and earth than in many of our high, empty cathedrals, where all is there except the real thing.